Hello, everyone. On today's podcast, I'm going to talk about, the claims that it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. And, and also the claim that it's impossible to prove that God exists. You know, there's also a claim that it's impossible to prove that God, no, I've already said it. No, these are the two. Atheists claim it's impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. And they also claim that it's impossible to prove that God exists, right? Well, it's true, but it's only true from their perspective. If you've already given up on looking for proof, right? If you've already given up on building a car, that's impossible for you to build a car. If you've already given up walking to the store, then it's impossible for you to walk to the store. If you've already given up trying to prove that God exists, then it's impossible to prove that God exists. If you've already given up to prove that God doesn't exist, then it's impossible for you to prove that God doesn't exist. Your mindset determines what you're capable of doing in this world. God says, through me, you can accomplish all things. You are God. God is omnipresent. It means that you are God. And nothing is impossible for God to do. Since God is omnipresent, it implies that every single human being on this planet is God. And as long as you know who you are, there's nothing you can't do in this world. And that includes proving that God exists and and proving that God, doesn't exist. You can do both. Why? Because nothing is impossible. And I've done that in many, many episodes of my podcast. I know it's contradictory for God for you to say that there's no way God can both exist and not exist at the same time. And yes, it is contradictory. But yet, this world is a world where both contradictory opposites exist simultaneously as one. A magnet is both positive and negative as one. Distance is both far and near as one. Although things appear contradictory, as long as you know the patterns of the world, as long as you know how the world works, you realize that light is both a particle and a wave as one. And quantum physics shows that these two contradictory states exist simultaneously as one within light. Light can be either a particle and a wave at the same time. Contradictions exist within the world. The entire world is created out of contradictions. Two opposing forces, two dual forces. We live in a world of duality, like I've said it many times. So yes, it is impossible to prove that God exists. It is also possible to prove that God exists. Perspective determines your reality. If you have a negative mindset, if you've already given up on life, it is impossible for you to prove that God exists. If you've already given up on life, it is impossible to prove that God doesn't exist. If you've already given up on life, it is impossible for you to build a car. If you've already given up on life, it is impossible for you to build your own computer. Because you've already determined inside your own mind that this is impossible, this is possible, and this is impossible. The things you believe are impossible will only be impossible just for you and nobody else. For somebody else, it is possible. And here's a possible way to prove that God exists. In the Bible, it states that God created all things, right? And God is omnipresent. It means God is all things. God created the world through his own body, right? Although this isn't a direct proof, this shows you, This proof that I'm going to state shows you that God can be both, existing and non-existent at the same time. Why? Is because, like I said it before, for God to create the past, God must create the future. The past and the future are two contradictory concepts, yet they exist simultaneously as one. For God to create left, God must also create right. Left and right are two contradictory sides, yet they exist simultaneously as one. Left and right comes together to create distance. Before and after, past and future come together to create time. For God to create existence, God must also create non-existence. God must create existence and non-existence at the same time, just like God created left and right at the same time, the past and the future at the same time, positive and negative at the same time, particle and wave at the same time, large and small at the same time, inside and outside at the same time, finite and infinite at the same time. These contradictory forces, these contradictory concepts come together as one. And since God is omnipresent, it means God is both left and right at the same time. God is both before and after at the same time. God is both inside and outside at the same time. God is both a particle and a wave at the same time. God is both what? Existent and non-existent at the same time. God created both because for existence to exist, non-existence must be there as a contrast. For the past to exist, the future must also exist. Otherwise, there's no such thing as time. For left to exist, right must also exist, or there's no such thing as distance. This is how life works. Both contradictory concepts must exist simultaneously as one. And since God is omnipresent, it means God is both existent and non-existent simultaneously. These two concepts, these two dual and opposite concepts exist within God as one. There's a part of God that exists and a part of God that doesn't exist. There's a part of God that's on the left. There's a part of God that's on the right. There's a part of God that's in the future. There's a part of God that's in the past. There's a part of God that's here. There's a part of God that's there. There's a part of God that's small. And there's a part of God that's large. There's a part of God that's infinite. And there's a part of God that's finite. This is how our world works. It is possible to prove that God exists, and it's also possible to prove that God doesn't exist, because God is both simultaneously as one. Because God has to create all concepts. For both concepts to exist, God, for one part of a concept to exist, the other part must exist as well. So God created every single equal and opposite, concept as one within himself. So when you say that God doesn't exist, you're right. But you're also wrong. Because God also exists. God is the reason why you're here. Because God is everything. And when God is everything, God will also be nothing. This is how life works. And it's easy to prove that God exists. This is just proving that God can both be, existent and non-existent. But, my previous episode gives you an example, that shows you how, you can prove that God exists. I've proven that God exists in the previous episode. Listen to that episode, and then you come to this one. And then you find, you understand what I'm trying to say here. God is everything in this world. You are God. but God is also not you. You are God, but God is also not you, because God is also everything else. God is the tree, the house, the universe you live in. God is everything, including you. The part can never be greater than the whole. You are God, but you're also not God at the same time. This is how, contradictory this world is. You are God, but yet, from a different perspective, from your perspective, you are an individual human being. Yet from God's perspective, everything in this world is God. Because God is the creator of all of it. Everything you see is God. Yet everything functions on its own. Everything behaves like its own, individual being, its own individual life form, its own individual atom or item. Everything in this world is God. So that's it for today's podcast episode. I pray for everyone to live a great and happy life. Amen. Bye.